transition words. What are transition words? Words like and, but, nonetheless, in spite, despite. He has to provide some information that is going to substantiate the claim, identify the flaws or the challenges in the argument, right? So you are assuming that it's valid for everyone taken into consideration. But the person meets with an accident, right? That's also the gap. Hi, my dear students. I hope you are doing well. So let's begin with the critical reasoning sessions. The first session that we are going to work on would be dissecting the argument. तो देखिए कभी भी क्रिटिकल रीजनिंग का क्वेश्चन क्रिएट होता है सो इट हैज़ गॉट थ्री मेजर पार्ट्स द फर्स्ट पार्ट इज अ स्मॉल पैराग्राफ which in technical terms we call an argument. The second part is a question stem and the third would be the answer choices. But the question and the answer choices would come later into consideration. What should be the first goal? To rightly understand how the argument is composed. So in this quick video, we are going to dissect the argument. Let's get started. My name is Juhi Narula. तो देखिए सबसे पहले इट्स रियली इंपॉर्टेंट टू अंडरस्टैंड दैट व्हाट आर द क्वेश्चंस अप टू. द क्वेश्चंस आर intending to check on your analytical and reasoning skills, right? So that is the reason they would give you a small paragraph. They would ensure that you rightly understand the question task. You do not get into the trap of outside knowledge or information driving your answer choices. You have a balanced and a rational approach. So then what is this question intending to ask? So when we talk about the argument, so it's a small paragraph which in technical terms we call an argument. So in an argument, the goal of the author is to reach to a claim or a conclusion. So what is the goal? There is an objective of writing, right? The author wants you to believe in something. So that's something that we call claim or conclusion, right? So I go to my boss and I say, sir, I need a salary increment. So this is the claim that I'm making. Now, the next question my boss might ask is, why should I give you a salary increment? So the points that I present in order to validate my claim, those points in technical terms we call evidence or premise. So we'll be using claim or conclusions interchangeably, right? And we'll be using evidence and premise interchangeably. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, right? And the entire discussion would more or less revolve around these concepts in today's session. So like I said, the first part is the argument or the passage. And these are various types of questions that you are going to, encounter in the exam. There can be questions based on strengthening, weakening, assumptions, flaws, inferences, structure, bold-faced reasoning, and then paradox questions. So these are major categories that you get in the exam. But if you understand the argument rightly, right, and if you understand that what are the components of an argument, you are very easily able to get a great hold on strengthening, weakening, assumption, and flaw questions, right? Which is actually the dominated area in the critical reasoning segment. So we are going to focus our energies rightly on the argument, right? Like I said, the third aspect will be the options. So the first thing that you need to understand is that the claim or conclusion is something which the author is trying to establish. That's the objective of writing. That's the purpose, right? तो क्यों लिखा जा रहा है passage को? That's what in technical terms we call claim or we call it conclusion, right? Now, there can be certain conclusion indicators that will help you identify the conclusion effectively. And these are the words you should be very, very careful whenever you encounter. So there are transition words. If you have seen some of my reading comprehension videos, I really put a lot of emphasis on rightly identifying the transition words. What are transition words? Words like and, but, nonetheless, in spite, despite, but, moreover, furthermore, right? So these words help you understand how is the author taking the discussion forward. Now, similarly, there are conclusion indicators which help you identify that what is the conclusion in that small paragraph. There's a paragraph provided, then there is a conclusion in it, right? So how do you identify that this statement acts as a conclusion? So most of the times there is a conclusion indicator which really makes your life sorted. So you should be really careful. Initially, what will happen is that you would have to pay attention to observe these words, but sooner or later, if you get into the rhythm, you'll be able to identify the conclusion statement very quickly. Now, the next part is the premise, right? So what is a premise? Now, The author is trying to establish the conclusion, but how would he establish the conclusion? He has to provide some supporting statement. He has to provide some information that is going to substantiate the claim. So that particular statement we term as evidence or premise, right? So say for instance you apply to a university, right? Then when you are giving your application, that's the claim that I am good for this course, take me in, right? Now, would that be sufficient? No. You have to offer your GMAT scores, right? In some cases, IELTS and TOEFL score as well. You have to show your work experience. You have to have a great SOP. You need to have letter of recommendation. So, what are these entire, pointers doing? They are acting as evidence. They are trying to justify your claim that you are good, right? They are trying to validate your claim, they are trying to substantiate your claim, and that's what exactly evidence or premise ka role is there in the argument, right? So you have to always consider ki whatever information is offered in the form of evidence or premise, this will always be true. You are never going to challenge this information. There can be some cases where you feel that the information is incorrect because of your prior experience or knowledge, but the way it is offered in the question, critical reasoning argument, it has to be, must be, should be considered true. Now, what happens is there is a gap or flaw in the argument. We'll be able to understand gap or flaw better by taking an example. But before that, you can also note down these premise indicators. This is very, very important. And this is the list present here. So, if I say, I want to be a part of this program because I feel that my current skill set will be developed further by enrolling in the course, right? So words like because, since, given that, indicated by, these are all premise indicators. Now, once we are clear with the conclusion and premise, we are going to explore one more side or one more important aspect of the argument, which is usually not taken into consideration. Let's consider this particular example, right? Then I'll talk about that aspect, which in technical terms we call an assumption. But before that, let's take a look at this particular argument. So I'll just step aside so that you can read it nicely and it's easy to explain. A study was conducted on a group of office going people, and it was found that people who eat 5 meals in a day are healthier and fit as compared to people who eat 3 meals in a day. Hence, can you see this is a conclusion indicator? So this is the conclusion statement in the argument. It can be concluded that people who take frequent meals have better longevity as compared to people who take only 3 meals. So this is the conclusion the author is trying to establish. And how do you validate this conclusion? How can we say that people who take frequent meals have longer life? Because this particular statement is acting as a premise in the argument. Because you will say, ma'am, see, it is mentioned a study has been conducted. Now, if you take a look at the argument prima facie, you will not find much of the challenge. You will accept the argument, right? You will say, yes, this makes sense. By एक study ने conclude कर लिया that if you're taking frequent meals, उससे you are living longer, right? But if I ask you that you have to identify problems in this argument, right? You have to identify there are some major challenges or flaws, or we can call loophole, or we can call gap, however you term it. All the three mean the same. So then the gap is कि भाई study तो एक group of office going people पे conduct हुई थी और आप इसको generalize कर रहे हैं on everybody, right? So there can be adults, there can be children, there can be toddlers, there can be teenagers. उनका क्या, right? तो office going people take certain segment of people है. What about people who are sports men, people who are athletes, people who are businessmen, right? उनका क्या कहानी है? So that's a major gap. Study तो group of office पे हुई, उनका result generalize कर दिया गया. अब क्या frequent meals only consideration है? अब मैं 5 मील ले रही हूँ but I am eating unhealthy food, I am eating junk. Would that help? Or there can be some family history of disease running, right? What about that? Or maybe, somebody has had a genetic disorder since childhood. What about those factors, right? या तो author clearly कह देता this is the only factor, but that's not what the author is doing, right? The author is saying कि भाई there is a study done and people who are eating 5 meals in a day, they are healthier and fit as compared to people who eat 3 meals in a day. So based on this, we can, draw a conclusion that if you're eating frequent meals, you are living longer, right? There can be other factors. Maybe I'm just, having a stagnant lifestyle. I'm not moving much, right? Or hardly I'm, getting into any, movement. So then what if I have a poor lifestyle? So those factors the author has not taken into consideration. So now we are in this particular situation where there is a premise, there is a conclusion, but there is a gap in the argument. There are so many areas or aspects that have not been taken into consideration while establishing the conclusion. तो अब हम इस स्थिति में क्या करें? What should we do in this particular situation? See, premise we cannot target. I told you before as well that whatever is offered as premise, you have to consider it to be true. आप प्रिमाइस नेगेट नहीं कर सकते, कंक्लूजन आप नेगेट नहीं करना चाहते, आप ये कह देंगे तो इनवैलिड कंक्लूजन है. सो देन द एंटायर पर्पस ऑफ क्रिएटिंग द आर्ग्यूमेंट्स गेट्स डिफीटेड, राइट? फिर तो आपने आर्ग्यूमेंट को कोलैप्स ही कर दिया और आर्ग्यूमेंट में अब गैप है. गैप क्या है? देयर आर सर्टेन एस्पेक्ट्स व्हिच हैव नॉट बीन टेकन इनटू कंसिडरेशन. नाउ व्हाट डू वी डू? Now here, to overcome this gap, we bring into account the third aspect of an argument, जिसको हम technical terms में assumption कहते हैं. So assumption is what? Assumption is implicit in nature. Implicit समझते हैं? छुपा हुआ, something which is not directly stated, right? जिसको आप directly state नहीं करते, not directly stated. जैसे there is a match between India and Pakistan and we lose 2 wickets and Virat Kohli comes on the crease and you take a sigh of relief. What did you assume? This gentleman is going to play well, right? Or if it is cloudy outside, you carry an umbrella. What is the assumption? That it can possibly rain and you can become wet. Or it's a long day at work and suppose you're going on outskirts of the city and you carry some extra food. So what is the assumption? That since you are going to an outskirt location, you might not get good food, right? So all these three are assumption. It's not directly stated, but आपने मान लिया. तो प्राइमा फेसी अगर हम उसी आर्ग्यूमेंट पे जाएं जो अभी रीड करके आ रहे थे, right? This argument. So once you would have read it in the beginning, you would not have found any trouble with it. You would have absolutely accepted it. It's here I forced you to identify the flaws or the challenges in the argument, right? Because you assume that ठीक है ऑफिस गोइंग लोगों पे तो generally सब पे ट्रू होता होगा और ये this might be a really important parameter on which the longevity is dependent, right? बट एक्चुअली में ये आपने क्यों किया? क्योंकि आपने अजम्पशन को कंसिडरेशन में ले लिया था. सो व्हाट इज एन अजम्पशन डूइंग? What is the role of an assumption? Assumption is basically bridging the gap between premise and conclusion. Like I said, premise you cannot negate, conclusion you do not wish to negate, right? Because the moment you say that, okay, these many factors were not taken into consideration, then the author cannot reach to this particular conclusion. So basically, making the argument go invalid, right? So what do? You take into account assumption. So assumption is case mein aapne kya liya? You have taken multiple assumptions, right? See, these were the gaps, right? So the age group of the people on which the study was conducted is not mentioned. So aapne ye assume kar liya that if it is true for a certain set of people, it will be true for everybody. The information provided in premise is only restricted to the fact that people are office going. Conclusion is general. So you are assuming that it's valid for everyone taken into consideration. So premise of the argument mentions people are healthier and fit, जबकि conclusion longer life की बात करता है. So this can happen, the person is healthy, but the person meets with an accident, right? That's also the gap. And the author has not taken into consideration the other factors that I was taking into consideration, the lifestyle factor and what is the family history, right? So what do you do in this case? In this case, you assume, right? So what do you assume? You assume that if the study is true for office going people, it will also be true for everybody. And being healthier and fit bears direct association with longevity. Also, you have considered that frequency of the meals is only and the major factor responsible to live a longer life. Now, there is an interesting thing. Once you understand the concept of assumption, you can easily tackle the questions of weakening and strengthening. Now, you understand what is the flaw. Flaw basically means important pointers not taken into consideration while drawing the conclusion. So, this is what we mean by flaw. What is assumption doing? Assumption is actually bridging the gap, right? So it is bridging the flaw, it is bridging the gap that exists between premise and conclusion. You can also say gap to be loophole or the challenge, right? However you would want to refer it, or flaw, however you would want to say it, right? Now, say for instance, you have to weaken the argument. So the moment you point out the other factors, you are weakening the argument, right? So in a way, assumption में हम कह रहे थे कि कोई और factor नहीं है. Frequency of meals is a major factor, the only factor. When you say there are 10 other factors, you are weakening the argument. So in a way, you are targeting the assumption. So if you target the assumption, you weaken the argument, right? And this is valid for any argument in the world. Right, so that is the reason we always say that you should have very solid fundamentals, because being a working professional, you cannot take time out to practice hundreds and thousands of questions. You should do 10 questions intelligently so that you understand how the game is played and you're absolutely ready to ace in the exam, right? So how do you target how do you weaken the argument? You target the assumption. The moment you point out other factors, you're basically weakening the argument, right? And the moment you substantiate the assumption, you are strengthening the argument, because in a way assumption is helping you hold the conclusion, right? So what would be the right way to strengthen the argument? You are going to validate the assumption, right? So you say, okay, in another research it was shown, the similar results were shown. So that means you are trying to validate the assumption that frequency of meals plays a very decisive and important role, right? So this is how an argument looks like. There's a premise on which the conclusion is based. At times there are certain important pointers not taken into consideration while drawing the conclusion. So the missed details we call flaw or loophole, and then we take assumption into consideration because we really do not want our conclusion to get collapsed. And in order to weaken the argument, we target the assumption, and in order to strengthen the argument, we validate the assumption. So I hope you are now better with the understanding of this particular argument. We are going to explore a lot more in the upcoming sessions. Keep working hard, stay consistent. All the best.